Greetings, students. Mr. Little here, and today we're going to have a look at Chapter 35, Part 2, Latin America Between the World Wars, Revolution, Nationalism, and Populism. So by the end of this presentation, you should be able to answer the two following essential questions. One, how did the Mexican Revolution influence later movements for economic, social, and political change across Latin America? And two, how did global economic shifts after 1930 influence the rise of new political and cultural movements across Latin America? If you haven't figured it out, we're talking about Latin America. If you are a person who likes to know geographically where places are being talked about during presentations, I will refer you to this map, which will talk about some of the locations that we're going to reference in this presentation. So if you need to pause the video and come back to this map, by all means, please do so. Let's talk a little bit about the themes of interwar Latin America. So some things we're going to see as we go through this presentation. One is that during this time, there was a spate of revolutions and popular governments. So in particular, the Mexican Revolution and the Estado Novo in Brazil, which was a popular government. There was also the rise of ethnic nationalism along the lines of which we might have seen in Europe a century before, and including a particularly interesting version of ethnic nationalism called Indigenismo. We also saw a form of economic nationalism, that is a desire to take control of the economic life of a nation. And we see this through corporatism as well as developmentalism. We also see the influence of the Russian Revolution, in part through the socialist nature of these popular governments, as well as the works of artists such as Diego Rivera, who were highly influenced by the course and the objectives of the Russian Revolution. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the Mexican Revolution from 1910 to 1920. And while the chronology and the timeline of the Mexican Revolution can get really complicated and really windy and twisty, we're just going to go over the basics and what you need to know. So what you do need to know is that prior to the revolution, there was a person ruling Mexico named Porfirio Diaz who had risen to power via defeating the French who'd been occupying Mexico. And while he brought a great deal of foreign investment and industrialization to the country, this also brought a great deal of inequalities. For example, 97% of the land was held by 1% of the population. This discontent manifested itself in several revolts, such as the Yaqui Revolt, led by indigenous Native Americans in 1896, as well as the Baja Revolt, led by a group of anarchists in 1910. One of Porfirio Diaz's political rivals announced the plan of San Luis de Potosi in 1910, which essentially called for a revolt against Porfirio Diaz. And while it started out slowly, it did eventually gain steam. And eventually, there were three different major factions fighting across the country for control. There was the government, there were the various campesino peasant leaders, Pancho Villa and Emiliano Zapata, as well as the constitutionalists. Now, in terms of radicalness, the Mexican Revolution was one of the more radical revolutions of the 20th century. The plan of San Luis de Potosi had in general called for a revolt against Porfirio Diaz. However, it had also vaguely, without being super specific, gestured at some sort of land reform or land distribution, which is, it's easy to be vague about when 97% of the population does not have any land. The constitutionalists, with the bulk of the intelligentsia and the middle class leading the revolt, seemed to kind of drag their heels about the land reform thing. And so it came down to two campesino leaders, Pancho Villa and Emiliano Zapata, in their respective territories, Pancho Villa in Sonora and Emiliano Zapata in Chiapas, to take it upon themselves to redistribute some land, where they would often redistribute land back to the peasants, taking it from the rich and giving it back to the poor. In fact, it was the motto of the Baja anarchists that Emiliano Zapata adopted, Tierra y Libertad, that's land and freedom, very similar to Lenin's peace, land, and bread. And this act is part of what makes the Mexican Revolution so radical in terms of the agency taken by its participants. In particular, Emiliano Zapata, in the territory that he consolidated from 1914 to 1917, established the Morelos Commune, a experimental society where individuals were given land to work according to their needs and required to give back to the community according to what they could give. And it didn't really have a set ideology, but Emiliano Zapata famously said that he who works the land should own the land. And while the Morelos Commune was a bold experiment, it didn't last very long. After the constitutionalists secured their hold on the Mexican government, they rapidly came down to secure their authority over the region. The Mexican Revolution is also noted for the large numbers of women who participated in combat and logistical roles, known as soldadas or female soldiers, who were essential in securing the victory of both the constitutionalists and the campesino leaders of Pancho Villa and Emiliano Zapata. When the constitutionalists came together in 1917 to write a new constitution following the defeat of Porfirio Diaz's successors, it was the pressure from the campesino armies, the Indians, as well as organized labor unions, that forced the constitutionalists to push a little bit further in terms of social rights than they might have initially wanted to. And this means that the Constitution of 1917, which is still Mexico's constitution to this day, is the first constitution in history to lay out what we call social rights, not just political rights, which have been a big part of the Atlantic revolutions. So social rights refer to things like the right to education, the right to a living wage, and the right to safe work standards. All of these things are guaranteed in the Mexican Constitution. So for example, Article 123, which is considered one of the more radical articles of the Mexican Constitution, guarantees an 8-hour workday, guarantees the rights to strike. It bans child labor and forbids pregnant women from working. In addition, there was an attempt to reassert the national economic sovereignty of Mexico. For example, Articles 27 and Article 28 gave the government exclusive right to redistribute the land and to control the mineral wealth of Mexico. This was a direct pushback to the various American and European companies that were operating in Mexico under Porfirio Diaz and who had long exploited Mexico's mineral and oil wealth. And while it's fair to say that perhaps not every single article of this constitution has always been followed to the letter, it has nonetheless set the stage and influenced many later movements throughout Latin America. And as I said, it was the first constitution in history to lay out social rights alongside political rights. So among the legacies of the Mexican Revolution in Mexico itself was the creation of the PRI, or the Institutional Revolutionary Party, in 1929. The acronym makes sense in Spanish. And this was in part to prevent a succession struggle and to end what was known as the Age of the Caudillos, which you might remember me talking about in Chapter 30. This party would effectively prevent a future power struggle that might plunge Mexico into another civil war. And the PRI would go on to rule Mexico right up until the 21st century, although they sometimes did this through less than democratic means, much in the way the Kuomintang in China would also attempt to hold on to power through sometimes less than democratic means. But that said, in the early years, the PRI genuinely was dedicated to the goals and the legacy of the Mexican Revolution. For example, up to 1940, redistributing 60 million acres of land to mestizos and indigenous peoples, including returning the Ejidos, or the communal lands that had been lost by some Indians under the reign of Porfirio Diaz, to those communities, as well as establishing a farm credit system, establishing rural schools, and building hospitals. It was during this time, up to the 1940s, literacy went from 15% to almost 40%, a twofold increase. There's also the cultural legacy of the Mexican Revolution, which could be described almost as mestizo nationalism. Now, you might remember from the Atlantic revolutions this idea of criollo or Creole nationalism, and that is the idea that the Creoles, by nature of their unique connection to Europe, were uniquely destined to lead Latin America. It's at this time that that idea starts to lose a little bit of its steam, and the idea is that it's not their connection to Europe that makes the Creoles special, but it is the mestizos' mixed cultural heritage that makes them special and makes them uniquely qualified to lead. This could almost be thought of as a bit more of ethnic nationalism that had previously been seen. So, for example, this time saw the decline of Spanish and other European traditions in favor of more indigenismo traditions, so celebrations and glorifications of the indigenous past or the mestizo past, such as mexica and other indigenous symbols making their way into popular artwork. This also came about because of the efforts by the revolutionaries to resist two separate United States incursions, one including the seizure of the port of Veracruz and the other including a small U.S. invasion of northern Mexico to an attempt to capture or kill Pancho Villa after he had raided an American town. One of the other legacies in the realm of culture of the Mexican Revolution was the migrations of Mexicans to the United States. This had been a relatively minor affair prior to the Mexican Revolution, but the 10 years of violence and fighting had led almost 10% of the Mexican population to leave Mexico and head into the United States. Now, this was also prompted by some American businesses looking for cheap labor. And one of the other cultural legacies of the Mexican Revolution was the secular policy of the government. Finally, almost 100 years after the first revolution, the Catholic Church was finally restricted and removed from public life. Now, not everybody thought this was a good thing. In fact, a group of very devout Catholics named the Cristeros, or Soldiers of Christ, led a revolt against the government of Mexico for 3 years, one of the most powerful revolts in Mexican history since the revolution itself. And these Cristeros waved the symbol of the Virgin of Guadalupe as their rallying cry against what they perceived to be an atheist government. And while they were defeated in the end, it's a reminder that revolutions are contested spheres, and if it wasn't contested, it wouldn't be a revolution. The Cristeros revolt is also really interesting for its international aspect. One historian has found that the Ku Klux Klan of the United States, that's the racist, anti-foreigner, anti-African-American organization, actually gave the Mexican government $1 million to put down the Cristeros. In addition, the Knights of Columbus, which was a Catholic Italian immigrant organization, gave the Cristeros $10 million to buy arms and ammunition to fight the government of Mexico. So you have, from the United States, a racist, segregationist, anti-Catholic organization supporting the government of Mexico and an immigrant association, pro-Catholic organization supporting rebels against the government of Mexico. It's funny how history works that way sometimes. So moving a little bit further south from Mexico to Latin America, you might remember the economic imperialism from Chapter 32. That was where American companies like United Fruit were able to use their economic power and influence to leverage control over the economies and sometimes the infrastructure of Latin American governments. And this included being able to appropriate land at will and suppress any attempt at labor organizing. One of the more infamous episodes of this would be the Banana Massacre, which occurred in Colombia in 1928, where the United Fruit Security Services massacred a number of laborers attempting to organize a union to demand better conditions. This ability to influence governments when that might not have been enough, the United Fruit Company and the other fruit companies were not afraid to call in the United States military to protect their property when it was threatened. Case in point, a small U.S. transportation company that had built some infrastructure in Nicaragua felt like its infrastructure was in danger during a small Nicaraguan civil war in 1912 and hence called on the United States government to assist, who sent the Marines to occupy large parts of Nicaragua. Now, this did not sit well with one Augusto César Sandino, illegitimate son of a Creole landowner. He witnessed the first first stage of the U.S. invasion of Nicaragua in 1912, and later, inspired by the Mexican Revolution, pledged to support the opposition to the U.S.-backed government of Nicaragua. Sandino declared war on the United States in 1927 and waged a guerrilla war with U.S. Marines until they were withdrawn from Nicaragua. That is not to say he was the reason they withdrew from Nicaragua, but Sandino's resistance and tenacity in the face of the U.S. military did receive both material and financial support from the new government in Mexico, as well as from the Comintern organization from the Soviet Union, along with the adoration of many across Latin America. So Augusto Sandino would be betrayed and killed in 1934 following the withdrawal of U.S. troops, but his legacy would live on. He would be featured prominently in some of the works of Diego Rivera, and about 30 years after his death, another group of activists who sought to resist an American-imposed government in Nicaragua would form a group and take the name of Sandino. They would be called the Sandinistas, and we'll talk more about them in chapter 37. In El Salvador, a little further south, Farabundo Martí founded the El Salvador Communist Party and attempted to overthrow the corrupt local government in the La Matanza uprising. However, this was brutally suppressed by the army of El Salvador and resulted in the massacre of several indigenous groups that had been involved. In Costa Rica, a non-violent form of resistance was the Great Banana Strike against United Fruit Company, which was forced to recognize the labor union after several months of striking. And as a result, Costa Rica has a high percentage of its labor force in a union, in part as a result of this first great successful strike against United Fruit. This economic imperialism had been going on for quite some time, but there was a fundamental change on the horizon. This is something called the Good Neighbor Policy, announced by U.S. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt in his inauguration speech. Previous presidents had been thinking about this, but it was becoming very apparent to him and his predecessors that simply intervening militarily in Latin America was beginning to become too expensive and was not winning them any friends. And so, upon taking the office of the presidency, Franklin Delano Roosevelt shifted American policy and pledged to no longer militarily intervene in Latin America. And as a result, he withdrew the Marines from Nicaragua, he withdrew them from Haiti, and he also withdrew them from Cuba, stationed there since the end of the Spanish-American War. Now, what might explain this change? Well, as I mentioned before, interventions are costly, and with the Great Depression, it was also just becoming expensive to deploy American soldiers overseas, and with rising fascism in Europe and militarism in Asia, the United States was desperately in need of allies and did not want to potentially antagonize all of Latin America into the arms of a fascist power like Germany. Now, how long will the good neighbor policy last is a good question, but a combination of the wider economic context and the tenacious resistance of Latin Americans to this economic imperialism, at least in part, forced a change of American policy in Latin America in the 1930s. Into the 1930s and through the 1950s, and in some cases even into the 60s, across Latin America, you see the rise of what we refer to as popular governments. And there are a couple of examples we're going to talk about today, including Mexico and Brazil, but many places across Latin America, including Argentina, Cuba, and Chile, they're what we call popular governments. Now, what is a popular government? Well, a popular government is a government that has a strong base in the masses. Now, this was usually the urban masses, the urban poor, and the urban middle class, except in Mexico, where it really was the peasants. And in part, the reason why they had such great support from these groups of people was the creation and funding of the social welfare and the support of labor unions, which won these new leaders the support of the urban population. And these governments were usually backed not just by those labor unions, but also by the military. They purported to speak in the name of the people. They were not democratic. These individuals usually ruled with an iron hand. And they opposed both communism, they also opposed fascism. These popular leaders tended to sort of flex themselves and turn themselves into whatever they needed to in order to stay in power. That means maybe they swing a little bit to the right, maybe they swing a little bit to the left, maybe they have some redistributive tendencies, and maybe they have some fascistic tendencies. It just depended on what they needed to do. Most of these governments featured some degree of corporatism and developmentalism, which we'll talk more about it, which includes things like import substitution industrialization, which I talked about in my Great Depression video, but also was willing to try to prevent labor strikes by negotiating between unions and large corporations. And these governments almost always promoted ethnic nationalism. Now, especially in the case of Brazil, ethnic nationalism was a much newer thing versus the older elitist social Darwinism that had seen its mixed population as sort of a source of backwardsness or a source of shame. And instead, most of these new governments went on to promote indigenismos, or the new indigenous influenced identities. Let's first talk about the presidency of Lazaro Cardenas, president of Mexico from 1934 to 1940. Now, he was a very popular candidate from his region. He managed to win the PRI party's nomination in 1934 with both labor and military support. However, by the end of his term, it's notable, one of his legacies was removing the military as a key player in Mexican politics through his removal of key generals from positions of influence. Now, Lazaro Cardenas' regime is sometimes viewed as the high point of the Mexican Revolution, and that he himself was more dedicated to the principles of the revolution than anyone who would come after him. So, for example, he redistributed more land than all of his predecessors combined, something like 40 million acres. In the southern state of Soconusco, when there was a governor there who was anti-land reform and refused to allow the peasants to claim land that had been taken from them under Porfirio Diaz, Cardenas stepped in and removed him in 1936 and allowed the land to be broken up and returned to the people. Now, there's a case to be made that this land reform was just a way to get the campesinos more on the side of the government, but that is probably true. But that is in a way just politics. You do what you can to win your support. And there's also the truth that land reform was often very limited in reality. Despite the 40 million acres claim, there were many more claims of seized land under Porfirio Diaz that was not returned to their communities, in part because Mexico is a large country and a new government just simply doesn't have the resources to deal with every single claim. However, one of Cardenas's legacies is that he established a number of educational institutions in the countryside that would provide the groundwork for future activism and future efforts at land reform, even if he himself, this made him very popular amongst the people. But perhaps what made him even more popular and cemented his legacy in history was his nationalization, or the taking control of Mexican oil in 1938. So prior to 1938, almost all of the oil mined in Mexico was a concession given from the Mexican government to the Seven Sisters. These were 7 American, British, and Dutch oil companies. They were operating a company, I believe, was called Mexican Eagle Oil. And in 1938, Mexican Eagle Oil got into a dispute with the workers at one of their refineries. Now, the workers and Mexican Eagle went to the Mexican Supreme Court, and the Mexican Supreme Court ruled in favor of the workers and said Mexican Eagle had to improve their working conditions. However, Mexican Eagle simply ignored this and continued to operate as normal. More than just ignoring the ruling of the Mexican Supreme Court, the Seven Sisters had actively antagonized the Mexican government by promoting and publishing anti-government newspapers, as well as by attempting to stir up anti-government militias in certain parts of the country during Cardenas's predecessor's time in office. In response, Cardenas authorized the nationalization of all the oil under Article 27 of the Constitution, which had previously been sort of softened to say that they simply wouldn't give out any more oil concessions, not that they would undo the existing ones. But in this case, he said, no, we're going to undo the existing ones. And this consolidated all of the mining infrastructure into a new single company run by the state called Petróleos Mexicanos, or Pemex. Now, the Seven Sisters were enraged, and the governments of the United States, Great Britain, and the Netherlands attempted to embargo Petróleos Mexicanos in an attempt to send it into bankruptcy. But when this didn't work, the Seven Sisters agreed to lift such an embargo in exchange for $250 million in damages they claimed from their lost infrastructure, to which Cardenas responded by saying, $250 million is the value of all the oil in New Mexico, which already belongs to us. Your equipment is probably worth like $10 million, and you've definitely made that money back, but we'll give you the $10 million anyways. And the Seven Sisters kind of had to take that deal because the United States, under the good neighbor policy, was not about to intervene in Mexico. And it's interesting, this was such a big deal in Mexico that many Mexican citizens came out into the streets with their family heirlooms and their silver and their rings and their jewelry, and they gave it to the government to help pay off this $10 million debt, because this was a source of national pride, the idea that Mexico was now independent of these foreign oil companies. Now, it's true that Petróleos Mexicanos did not initially have a good start. They did face an embargo, and some of the running of the company was not quite as efficient as, say, the Seven Sisters had been. But nonetheless, it was a key textbook example of economic nationalism and of a country attempting to assert its right to its own mineral wealth. Sort of an interesting epilogue to this is, once Mexico had nationalized its own oil, the Seven Sisters had to look elsewhere in the Americas for oil production, and they turned to a country that would become one of the largest oil producers in the Western Hemisphere, Venezuela. Let us shift and talk a little bit about Brazil and the reign of Getúlio Vargas, also known as the Vargas era, from 1930 to 1945, and again from 1951 to 1956. Now, the Brazilian Republic, which had existed since near the end of the 19th century and into the first couple decades of the 20th century, had been a country run on the export of cash crops and natural resources such as coffee and rubber. And though it had officially been a republic, it was largely a corrupt republic where the bosses of certain regions would assure the votes of whichever candidate they wanted to win. Now, during the Great Depression, with a slump in international purchasing, Brazil's economy went into a free fall. And Getúlio Vargas and a number of his military allies attempted to run an election against the candidate that represented the exporting interests. And even though they technically lost that election, they claimed that it was fraudulent. It probably was, but they then proceeded to seize power in 1930. And from 1930 to 1937, Vargas ruled essentially as a standard elected leader, didn't take a hardline position, and had to balance the competing demands of a fascist integralist party and a Alliance for National Liberation communist party, both of whom would at some point attempt to overthrow him in a coup. But it was the attempted communist coup in 1937 that led to his complete centralization of power, the creation of what he called the Estado Novo, or the new state, not to be confused with the one that existed in Portugal at the time too. And the centralization of power was a big shift for Portugal. Under the Republic and under the monarchy before the Republic, Brazil had essentially been a federation of a bunch of states, not really a single nation per se, but Vargas changed all of that. He even brought together all of the regional flags that existed and burned them in a ceremony at the capital. But like many other strong men that had some fascistic tendencies, he banned rival political parties, he censored the press, and he made Portuguese the official language and put pressure on European migrants from, say, Italy or Germany or Spain to speak Portuguese and not their initial language. Despite these harsh measures, he did receive a lot of popular support, in part because he created social welfare programs such as retirement, minimum wage, and maternity leave for women. That's not to say these were always well funded, and not to say that enforcement enforcement of them was always consistent. Nonetheless, it made him very popular among the laboring classes of the big cities. It's worth remembering that this was effectively urban support. Out in the countryside, most of these reforms did not reach, and therefore support was rather limited. Vargas was also known for his patronization of the new Afro-Brazilian culture, which was becoming popular at this time, and we'll talk a little bit about why later. Not only did he legalize some practices that had been previously illegal, but he also promoted new cultural hallmarks, such as the dance of Samba, which is now famous worldwide. In fact, more than that, he even approved and earmarked the creation of escolas de samba, or schools of samba, that would formally teach samba dancing, and samba has since become an international symbol for Brazil. He also promoted the Brazilian film industry by passing a law in 1939 saying that every movie theater has to dedicate at least a certain number of films to be from the Brazilian film industry. And he promoted radio ownership by making radios cheaper and providing subsidies for families that couldn't afford one. This way he could reach the masses more easily, much like FDR, much like Mussolini. He also supported a kind of developmentalism. Now, developmentalism is somewhat similar to corporatism, except it involves particularly a strong internal market and high tariffs on imported goods. So it's part of import substitution industrialization. So, for example, Getulio Vargas established the National Motor Company, initially that produced airplane engines, but would later go on to produce cars for Brazil, a National Steel Company in 1946, and consolidated all workers' unions into the National Labor Union. If this sounds a little bit like Mussolini's Italy, that's in part because it is. As I said before, many of the popular leaders of Latin America sort of oscillated and did whatever they needed to do to keep themselves popular. What's also interesting about the Vargas era is this is the first time that Brazil begins to actively encourage the exploration and exploitation of the Amazon rainforest, which it previously had not done, sort of viewing it as a green hell or a heart of darkness to be avoided. This is then going to be fundamentally a new part of Brazilian identity moving forward, is the connection of Brazil with the Amazon. All of this during the Vargas era effectively did transform Brazil from an agricultural exporting economy to at least a semi-industrialized economy. By 1950, industrial production accounted for a greater percent of the GDP than agricultural exports had. Now, that's not to say Brazil was fully industrialized, and Brazil is going to run into some problems in the 1950s and 60s, but its industrial production increased in Brazil as it declined in the United States during the 1930s. Just goes to show you that the Great Depression may have been bad for some, but it wasn't bad for all. Also, one thing I'd like to draw your attention to would be this picture on the side where there is a school child apparently reciting all the provinces of Brazil. This looks very much like the French nationalist painting, The Black Stain, from the 1890s, which is a quintessential symbol of European nationalism. So interesting comparison to draw there. And so I'd like to sort of just wrap things up with a little bit of talk about the cultural developments that kind of mirrored and went with the political developments during these interwar years. So in Mexico in particular, the nationalism that was prompted by the Mexican Revolution really comes out in the murals of Diego Rivera, the famous artist, who created a number of murals to tell the story of Mexico. And the murals, I might add, serve a dual purpose. In a country where most people are illiterate and most people cannot read, big, gigantic murals scrawled across walls or the fronts of buildings can help tell a story better than some complex form of writing. So, for example, Diego Rivera talked about the struggles of Mexico dealing with economic imperialism and other countries dealing with economic imperialism. For example, his work, Imperialism, which includes a reference to Augusto César Sandino from Nicaragua, as well as his acknowledgement of the indigenous and campesino contributions to the Mexican Revolution. This can be seen in the Ballad of the Revolution, which is a multi-part mural, which I believe is actually in the basement of the Mexican Ministry of Education in Mexico City. I could be wrong about that, but I think that's where it is. It's a multi-part mural. It's all along a very long hallway. And Diego Rivera was not alone in telling the story of Mexico through its history. His one-time wife and longtime artistic companion, Frida Kahlo, also created artwork that reflected the dignity of Mexican and indigenous folk art. Many of her artistic motifs reflected the long history of mestizo and indigenous artistic practices in Mexico. And so both Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo, through their work, reflected this new pride, this new mestizo Mexican identity. In general, this can sort of be described in the phrase Indigenismo, which is the idea of a connection with a national identity and an indigenous people. Now we're a unique state because of our national identity is tied up with this indigenous identity. And so in Brazil, I mentioned that there was a rejection of this old social Darwinist idea that the Afro-Indian element of the Brazilian population was something to be ashamed of or something to be feared or suppressed or replaced by, say, the influx of European migration during the age of imperialism. A book published in 1933 called The Master and the Slave essentially documented the long tradition of masters creating children with their slaves in a probably more romantic form than it actually happened. Essentially, it gave permission to be proud of Brazilian culture, arguing that Brazilian culture was the product of intermixing of European, Indian, and African elements. Dances like samba became popular and accepted, and why people like Carmen Miranda became the new international symbol of Brazilian culture and toured the world and gave a positive view to Brazil. No longer simply a corrupt cash crop exporting monarchy, it was growing into a proud, self-aware nation. This could also be seen in other states in South America, such as José Carlos Maria Tegui's philosophy that combined Incan history and Incan traditions with socialist ideas. It's going to go on to influence many future movements across South America, including including a group called the Shining Path. While these developments were definitely a drastic step, this did not eliminate discrimination. This also did not eliminate colorism. Remember how I said that many of the popular leaders, with the exception of Mexico, were fundamentally urban movements. They were not countrywide movements. In the countryside, where mostly indigenous and mestizo people lived, they were left out of many of these benefits, and they still faced discrimination, and they still faced high levels of poverty. And activists continued to fight for their rights, such as Tránsito Amaguaña, an activist in Ecuador who worked into the 21st century to fight for reforms, among other things, the recognition of the Incan language of Quechua to be utilized in public spaces, was to assist with the creation of the Ecuadorian Federation of Indians in 1944, to again push for indigenous rights and push for recognition of indigenous cultures. So while there may have been a push on an official level and government sponsored, and even amongst the intellectual elite of many of these countries to explore their indigenous connections, that is not to say that everything was perfect and that indigenous people did not continue to face discrimination and difficulties. It's always worth remembering there's change and continuity in everything. And so we'll just end with two small bits of artwork to kind of get at what I've been talking about. So on the left, we see this old painting from the Brazilian Republic called Ham's Redemption. The idea being that in the eyes of the Brazilian Republic, they needed to Europeanize or whiten their population. So for example, you can see 3 generations of Brazilians going from very dark skinned to medium colored skin to light colored skin. This was the ideology of the Brazilian Republic that preceded the Vargas era and is very much in the mold of social Darwinism. On the right, you can see a section of Diego Rivera's gigantic mural, The Aztec Marketplace, which depicts in grand detail the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan. And again, Diego Rivera, one of his fundamental traits was to tell the story of Mexican history through his work, and this included exploring the indigenous side, including Mexica and other indigenous cultures and their architecture and their history as well. So I want to thank you for joining me. You should definitely be able to answer the questions from the beginning of the presentation. My name is Mr. Little, and I'll see you next time.